there's a real lack of ecologists at the
Mm.
minute, as I'm sure many people will have realised. There's just not enough of us, and there's a risk that there's going to be quite big backlogs. We spoke to some ecologists this summer who were working on a 16-week turnaround for just getting to site.
Just a quick heads up that this is the last episode of 2024. We'll be back on the 7th of Jan 2025 with an amazing episode with Daniel Moore talking about creativity. So do not miss that. Now, on to today's episode. Ecological consultancy plays a vital role in shaping a more sustainable future within the construction industry. As environmental regulations tighten and the importance of biodiversity becomes more widely recognised, the expertise of ecological consultants is increasingly in demand. These professionals are essential in guiding projects towards compliance with ecological standards, ensuring that development is balanced with the preservation of natural habitats. By integrating ecological considerations into every phase of construction, from planning to execution, we can mitigate environmental impacts and contribute to a more sustainable built environment. Now, all this sounds easy, and I feel like most of the time it can be summarized by simply not being a dickhead about things and simply doing the right thing. To put this into some context, we need to chat to someone who understands the whole ecological environment from within the construction industry. Sarah Stone has over 17 years' experience within ecological consultancy. During this time, she's been involved in all aspects of ecological surveys, reporting, and assessments for a variety of clients. Her current role sees her leading the technical aspects of the ecology team at BWB Consulting, as well as delivering the full suite of habitat and protected species surveys and reports. The team has an increasing focus on providing commercial advice in relation to projects' biodiversity net gain requirements, BNG. Sarah has been delivering and overseeing BNG assessments for a number of years and is proficient in the use of the statutory metrics for calculating both the baseline and post-development units and advising clients on the best way to minimize their costs. Now, there's a few things in there that I didn't quite get myself, even though it was my intro. So, first of all, Sarah, welcome to the podcast. And did I miss anything off that intro?
No, I don't think so.
Excellent. That's great stuff. So let's get into demystifying some of the things that I've just said in your intro. So, biodiversity net gain, BNG, has become a crucial consideration in UK construction, especially following the Environment Act of 2021, which mandates a minimum 10% BNG on new developments as of February this year. With each passing mandate, law, legislation, the construction landscape is being reshaped for the better. So, firstly, let's rewind. Can you explain what BNG is and what impact it's having within construction?
Yeah. So BNG, biodiversity net gain, is the idea that the construction industry is going to leave the natural world in a better state than it found it. So the site that you're working on, whatever that may be, will be better ecologically or from a biodiversity perspective after the development has taken place. So it uses habitats as a proxy for biodiversity. So the idea being that if you create good quality habitats, that in turn will attract the invertebrates, which will attract further and further up the food chain to create greater biodiversity. So it involves measuring the biodiversity unit. So a biodiversity unit is sort of a nominal figure based on a number of factors that we measure at the baseline stage, and then we measure again post-development and compare to look at where the gains or losses, as it may be, have occurred, and then what we can do to make sure that we're getting that mandatory 10% gain. So it's obviously a very big change for the construction industry. I think when I started out in ecology, there was very little consideration of biodiversity and ecology at all in the construction industry. And it's been really noticeable that that has improved over time. Um, and I think people got quite used to the idea of working towards no net loss, which was written into the MPPF a few years ago before a gain was written in. And people started to sort of understand that idea, but people thought that they could stick up a bat box, stick up a bird box, and that was job done. Whereas actually, this is a much more involved process. It requires a lot more thought and a lot more consideration of biodiversity, and it really puts biodiversity really early in the planning
Mm.
phases for construction developments, and makes it really, really important, I think. And from our point of view, that's been one of the biggest changes that we've seen, that people are so not that people weren't taking it seriously before, but that people are taking it really seriously now, and
Mm.
realizing that the ecologists are a really critical part of that design team right from an early stage.
So what does that look like? I know that's a hugely it depends question to
Yeah.
answer, but in generally speaking, really hypothetically, quite generic, what does that look like from a new development perspective?
So we'd go out and we'd have a look at the habitats as early as we possibly could. And what we do is we record the different habitats that are on site, and we do what's called a condition assessment of those habitats. So each habitat has its own condition assessment that's a series of questions that have a yes or a no answer. And depending on how many yeses you get, depends on how good condition that bit of habitat is in. And it looks at things like, what's the botanical species diversity? Are there any invasive species? What's the structural diversity? That sort of thing. From that, we can then identify really high value habitats. So, for example, if you had a potential development site that had a really big block of woodland in the middle of it, and you got your ecologist to go out, have a look, and they said, oh, hang on a second, there's a big block of woodland in the middle.
Mm.
Following the kind of knowledge that we have, that's really, really high value habitat, and is really, really hard to replace. And so straight away, really early in the design stage, we'd be saying you need to be trying to keep that woodland, because if you
Mhm.
don't keep that woodland, you're going to be losing a lot of biodiversity, and you're going to have sort of big problems from a B&G perspective. And then it's about looking at where you can minimize disruption. So the first stage is always avoidance. So we look for the highest value habitats. Can we try and keep them? Then we'd look at where we can minimize impact. So there could be a really, really nice area of grassland on part of the pre-development site. Is it possible to keep some of it?
Mm.
Could you translocate it? That sort of thing. And then finally, what can we put back in? What can we kind of mitigate with afterwards? So designing the public open space, if there is going to be any, designing the suds features, even designing the street scene. So we see a lot of people now putting in street trees, things like that. All sorts of things that can be done to increase the biodiversity on the site.
Is there just one thing that springs to mind? And partly because in the background the TV was on last night, and there was I can't even remember what. Oh, it was something about Kent. I think there's a series about Kent at the moment on telly, and they were talking about Dover and the cliffs, and as the Channel Tunnel was being dug out, if you like, they got all the soil and put it next to the cliffs, and that's created a new habitat. Long-winded way of getting into this question, but on the face of it, when you see a new development, everything's new, and everything hasn't grown yet to a full habitat, if you like, or its full potential. Is there a time lag in this? Because if I was to go into a new development, I'd probably look at it and go, "Well, you haven't done this, ecological thing that you should have done because things aren't growing." Is there a time lag to this?
Yeah, so there absolutely is. So the timeline for biodiversity net gain as a whole is 30 years.
Right,
So we look at what is the habitat going to look like in 30 years.
right.
And any habitat that's created for gains, has to be guaranteed on site for 30 years. But also, when we feed the numbers into the metric, any habitats that can be retained. So this goes back to what I was saying about the woodland.
Mm.
A woodland, you're absolutely not going to recreate a woodland in 30 years. And so if you start off with a woodland and you chop it down and then you replant the same woodland effectively, you could have the same area of woodland, the same species, and so on.
Mm.
It will score much, much lower in the metric because to take into account that fact, exactly what you just said, that it takes time to become a functioning habitat. And so the new habitats score much lower than retaining existing habitats for that very, very reason.
Okay. That's interesting. It just sprung to mind there, and yeah, I mean, I didn't think you were going to say 30 years, but that makes sense. It doesn't just it doesn't just grow overnight. So integrating this type of thing into planning processes starts to add a level of complexity that wasn't there before. Yeah, it's vital to mitigate harm and protect species and habitats. Little stat in research, don't know how true this is, but since the 1970s, we've seen a decline of about 41% of all UK species, which is like quite a substantial decline. Um, what are the challenges of doing these surveys or trying to get this into plans? Um, and what are the opportunities?
Um, the challenges, there's many. So I think there's challenges in terms of doing the actual surveys. And so some habitats can be surveyed year round, and that's fine. Some other habitats have really, really tight timescales for doing the surveys. And so grasslands, for example, are much better if they're surveyed in the summer.
Okay.
And so that can be really, really tricky for developers to take into account if they suddenly take on a new site in, let's say, October, and they think, well, I want to get my planning application in pretty quickly, but they're struggling to get that information. And so that if we were approached with a site like that, we would take a precautionary view and we'd almost overgrade the habitats, because that's what the guidelines tell us to do,
Okay.
which then makes it harder to get a 10% gain. So that's quite tricky. There's a real lack of ecologists at the
Mm.
minute, as I'm sure many people will have realised. There's just not enough of us. And I think that applies to both consultancy and local authority. So many
Mm.
local authorities lost their local authority ecologists back in 2008 and have not replaced them. And there's a risk that there's going to be quite big backlogs,
Okay.
of local authorities not being able to deal with it because every single application should be having some sort of BNG assessment going in with it, and there's
Mm.
a lot of review involved in the process. There's a lot of extra reports for planning ecologists to read, and similarly finding the consultants who can do the work. Like I said, there's not enough of us on that side either, and it's we spoke to some ecologists this summer who were working on a 16-week turnaround for just getting to site, which like, and I think there's a lot of kind of sort of issues that will be ironed out. And I think the other thing to mention is that none of us quite know what's going to happen, that this is really new still. There's
Mm.
not that many applications that have gone through and needed 10% net gain.
Hmm.
As you said, it's been mandatory since February, but a lot of those applications that went in after the date when it became mandatory, it's not that long since they've been decided, if they have been decided. And so there's lots and lots of grey areas that nobody quite knows what's going to happen. Local authorities are changing their requirements all the time. So the way the legislation was written said that when you submit your planning application, you just submit baseline BNG, and the planning application is granted, or the planning permission is granted on the basis that you'll achieve a 10% gain. Some local authorities are asking for proof of that up front, but then that's really tricky because there's a
Mm.
lot of work goes into guaranteeing your 10%, particularly if you're going to have to look at off-site units and purchasing them. Other local authorities are not asking for that. Some of them change it on a daily basis.
Mm.
Um, So I think there's a lot of tricky areas, but I think there's a lot of positives to come from it. Like I think we know there's a biodiversity crisis in this country, and people want to live in green places with wildlife around them. And the 15-minute cities and 15-minute towns and things like that. People want to be near green space, and there's real opportunities for developers to produce something really good that and somewhere that people really want to live or work, and actually leave things in a better state for our children, our grandchildren, and so on. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity, but we have to get it right, and I think that's where it's proven a bit tricky at the minute.
Yeah, for sure. And it just highlights one, the diversity within construction in terms of roles and careers and what you can do, but also highlights the skill shortage, which when you say that, we always think of trades, we always think of people on site doing building work, and we forget the support and the secondary services that are vital, and the diverse nature of those roles. And if both are lacking in skills, then we need to hurry up and do something about it. And there's been multiple podcast episodes where we've spoken about that as well. Just moving the conversation on slightly, research conducted by BIM Howe in 2021 shows that the construction sector contributes a massive quarter to all air pollution and nearly half for drinking water pollution and landfill waste. So, with that in mind, it's clear that conservation efforts within construction are needed and they continually need to evolve with new methodologies and technologies, as we've seen with laws and legislations come in. But this also enhances the ability with new technologies and things like that to protect and restore habitats, or at least advise and guide. Understanding the advancements that are being made can guide construction projects towards more sustainable practices, which is fantastic. But what developments have you found to be most impactful within UK construction? So I'm talking about maybe the technology or the processes and the methodologies that might have changed throughout the years.
Um, it's a tricky question. You put
Or
me on
are
the
they
spot.
all the same? Or do we use the same types of methodologies to come up with these, or to tick the boxes or come up with these scores?
So I think from an ecology point of view, the habitat survey is a there's there's not that many different ways you can do habitat surveys.
Okay.
I think the way that we do BNG uses a different habitat scoring system to anything we've ever done before. So in the olden days, you'd have probably heard the term extended phase one habitat survey or a phase one habitat survey. And that was a way of categorizing habitats. That was a certain list that we used to categorize habitats, certain criteria. Whereas BNG is done using something called UKHAB, which is sort of a new way of categorizing habitats that we're all moving towards. And that's been a big change for the industry, and a new thing for people to learn and to get their heads around. But in terms of the actual outputs, I don't think it's made a massive difference. The process of going and collecting the data is still very similar. Obviously, being able to put a value on a habitat is completely new. That's something
Mm,
nobody's ever done before. I think looking broader at an ecology, and I know we're supposed to be talking about BNG, but sort of stepping outside of BNG for a second, DNA technology has had a huge impact on ecology as an industry. So when I started as a consultant, newt surveys, for example, involved 6 visits of bottle trapping, torchlight surveying, egg searching, pond netting, extremely expensive, time consuming for the client. Um, Survey visits having to be spread between March and June,
mm,
and each survey visit taking sort of a night. If you like, did some bits in the evening, set your traps in the evening, did a torchlight survey, went back the next morning, emptied your traps, did an egg search. Whereas now we visit a pond once, we take a DNA sample, and only if it comes back positive do we then have to carry on with our bottle trapping surveys. And DNA technology has been huge. It's so much faster, so much easier, so much more accurate. We can DNA test for what species of bats we've got in a bat roost. You can DNA test watercourses for crayfish.
Oh,
There's all sorts of different things from that perspective. Technology has improved accuracy of the wider surveys that we do. So bat surveys, for example, we used to use a little MP3 player and a heterodyne bat detector, whereas now we use infrared cameras to record the bats coming out so we can tell exactly where they're coming from, and exactly how many, because previously you sort of had a lot of surveyors squinting in the dark trying to count bats, whereas now we've got it all on infrared camera that we can review at our leisure the next day in the office. Um, and AI as well. So the ecology industry is starting to move towards using AI a little
okay.
bit. So we use AI for bat sound analysis, or we can use it for bat sound analysis. When we're out doing bat surveys, we record the noises that the bat makes. We record sonograms, and we can run them through an AI program that can tell us the species that we can then go back
Nice.
and check and see if we agree. And similarly with the video footage as well, the infrared footage that we're taking, there's programs that we can use that will pinpoint when there's movement on the footage. And so you can go back and you can check, well, was it a bat? Was it another surveyor wandering around when they shouldn't have been? Was it a moth? And so I think not necessarily applying to BNG because that's totally new
Mm,
anyway. But I think the wider ecology industry's got so much more efficient, so much more accurate, even in the last 10 years.
for sure. Yeah, I mean, it's always interesting to hear how technology is helping certain parts of the industry. Um, I think from my stretch of knowledge, it's using an app to understand uh, a bird sound or something like that. That's
Yeah,
about. But even that, we talk about skill shortages and we talk about getting people involved in nature and getting children out there and understanding what is out there. Little things like that massively help.
yeah. You can get apps that will tell you every plant species, which makes ecologists very lazy because we don't need to
Yeah.
learn them as much. But yeah, there's so many apps that you can get, and yeah, they definitely have a place.
Mm. Cool, excellent. So I want to turn our attention to probably the most controversial part. Well, it's not even controversial, but the tricky balancing act here of balancing biodiversity compliance with commercial viability. I can see it being a challenge in the construction
Yeah.
industry with margins being so thin anyway. So, how do you approach advising clients on balancing the need for biodiversity compliance with the financial realities of a construction project?
So I think the clients that we sort of get the best outcomes for are the clients who involved their ecologist earlier.
Okay.
So taking the example that I was saying earlier, where you've gone to site and you've got a big block of woodland in the middle, and if you lose that woodland, you're going to lose a lot of biodiversity units. If you've designed your whole site and got rid of that woodland because you haven't had an ecologist involved, there's going to be potentially a very big financial penalty to pay.
Hmm.
Whereas if your ecologist had been out there at the start and said, right, you really, really need to retain that if you possibly can, you're immediately saving yourself some money potentially in the long run. So I think the outcomes are more positive when the ecologist is involved right from the start and is part of that design team, able to sit with the master planners almost and go
Okay.
through it. And so that's kind of the first bit of advice that we give all our clients to minimize the impact on them is to get the ecologists involved really early. I think the way that biodiversity net gain has been designed and has been mandated is that on-site is always the priority.
Hmm.
And then if you can't achieve on-site, you can buy off-site units from an off-site provider, which could be you could get off-site units on land that you own but is without outside the red line boundary, or it could be off-site units from a specific provider, somebody like the Environment Bank or the local authority might have them. Um, they can be quite expensive, but they are not as expensive as having to buy statutory credits. So
Okay.
statutory credits are held by the government and they're designed to be an absolute last resort, and they cost a lot of money. So you don't really want to be in that position. So it's about trying to find the solutions as early as possible, approaching the right people as early as possible, talking to the right people as early as possible, and liaising with the local authority as well. If you do need to buy off-site units, do they know any local providers? Because there's
Mm,
something called the spatial multiplier when you're looking at off-site units, and the further away from your site it is, the more costly it is to buy the units. So you want to be within the same local planning authority area if possible. Um, and so then the sort of the final thing that we've done for a few clients is where we've looked at financial viability of sites. So we've worked out what a baseline of a site is, and then a client sent us a master plan and said, "Can you work out what my net gain or net loss is?" And we've done it, and then we've said, "Well, let's see what happens if we lose one house. What does that give us in terms of extra biodiversity gain?"
okay.
And then try and calculate the offset between where you've lost a unit, so you've lost X number of £1,000 in sale value, etc., but you've gained this many biodiversity units, which
Mm,
saves you a certain amount of money in having to buy off-site units, and you can balance it up in that way, which is something that we can do and we have done quite a few times, and that often helps people sort of put it into reality, that what exactly is the financial cost and can they lose units.
hmm.
And I think it's about working with the local authority and coming up with solutions with them. Sometimes they've got really good ideas as to where you can go to get units. Like I said, so yeah, I think earlier the better. That's take
Yeah,
home message.
yeah. I like the fact that you ended that with almost let's get creative. Let's have a look at what we can do. It's not just can't do this, can't do that. If you do this, you have to do that. It's almost okay. These are the stipulations. This is what we've got to work with. How can we make this fit into this habitat? How can we change things? I quite like that because that's almost an art form and a skill in itself. Thinking more creatively about humans and the natural habitat around them and combining the two. That sounds cool.
Yeah, I think that's something that so in our team at BWB we try really hard to do, is to work with the developers and with the landscapers to come up with something that's practical, that works for them and works for biodiversity, but also balances the books as well,
Mm,
because it's a commercial industry, isn't it? Buying and selling property and whatever that may be, there needs to be money at the end of it. And so it's something that we work really hard on, is trying to work with the developers. And even as far as if we've got a site and we say, well, if you put in 3 more trees, you're going to get a biodiversity gain,
mm,
working out what size of tree that they can afford on their landscaping scheme, because the bigger the tree, the more expensive. And it even goes into that level of detail
wow.
sometimes. And I think it's the bit that we really enjoy as well, that getting creative and
Of
coming up with
course,
something that works.
on the face of it, if you're looking at it from both sides, you don't want to be stood on site, sat in a room, and talking about um, plant trees. We need a pond. It's like it needs to be more detailed than that, and that's the exciting bit.
Yeah,
I,
definitely.
yeah, I suppose it's a bit like building a house or whatever. You don't just say we need a bathroom. It's whatever is in that bathroom. What does it look like? The shape and the style and things like that. And same, but in a more natural environment and natural way, which I like that. It's cool. Uh, okay, so final topic before we finish here uh, is although you're lacking in numbers, ecological consultancy is becoming hugely important because of the regulations and the restrictions that are not restrictions, but the restrictions that put on developers, but for the right reasons, if you like. Um, Looking towards the future, what does it look like for ecological consultancy? Can you see it? I know we were talking about new technology. and that having a slight impact. But do you see it changing in the near future, or is it pretty much a constant stream here?
Um, I think it will change. I think there's I think the introduction of BNG has opened up the door for even more ecologists, and I
Mm,
think the need to train up early career ecologists to be good at botany again. I think there there used to be a really big focus on training people to be good at botany, and then that sort of lapsed when legislation around bats and newts and all that sort of protected species side of things took over the headlines, and people forgot a little bit that they needed to be good at botany. But BNG is all about botany and habitats, and I think there's a shift back towards that more traditional ecological skills. I think it needs to become a much more joined up approach between ecology and wider sustainability, and looking at it, like you were saying before, looking at how it can work with air quality, how it can reduce noise
mm,
pollution, and a bigger environmental net gain rather than just a biodiversity net gain. And I think,
okay.
and I hope as well, I think that's the way it should go, and that's the way it is
Mm,
going, that it will become other industries and other disciplines will follow suit, and it will become about environmental net gain as a whole and how we can all work together to leave the environment in a better state. And you said there's been increases in air pollution, increases in noise pollution, and there's lots of integrated solutions that we could come up with. And so I think that's probably the way the industry will go. I think there's obviously technology, everything's getting more and more digital, higher use of AI,
mm.
and new technologies all the time that we perhaps can't foresee quite what's going to happen. I think you'll never replace ecologists. I think there's only so much that can be done with a drone, for example, or an infrared camera. You still need someone to go and set it up and analyze the data and so on. So I don't think it's an industry where we're all going to be replaced by machines. I don't think that's a particular concern at the minute, but there's definitely ways it can help us, and technology can definitely help, especially with the shortage of people. I think it's really exciting times. I think it's the biggest change in legislation since 2010 in our industry,
Mm.
and it's a really exciting time to be involved and to see how it's going to go and what's going to happen in the future, and how we can leave the environment in a really good state and create some really good things.
It seems like we're almost going backwards to go forwards in a way that I know we spoken about newts and bats getting the headlines, and like as soon as you said that, it just my mind started thinking of, yeah, that's all you ever hear, if a bat survey, a newt survey, that stopped a development if it can't knock down this because of that. And it's almost, well, that's fantastic for that small proportion of nature, but what about the rest of it? And looking at it from the perspective of, well, we don't get any of these species without an actual habitat, and so the habitat becomes the focus, because that is a requirement, which is a really cool way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think ecologists have had a bit of a bad rep over the
Mm,
years. And I think there's potentially a little bit of a rocky road ahead as everyone gets their head around BNG, and there are going to be some bumps in the road. There are going to be schemes that perhaps might get changed or might get refused permission because of BNG. But then I think a bit like bats and newts, they don't make the headlines anywhere near as much anymore because
yeah,
people have got their head around it and they know what they need to do, and people have embraced it, and the construction industry as a whole really understand it now, and hopefully BNG will go the same way.
cool, fantastic. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your insights. It's a really fascinating part of the industry which doesn't get any light other than when it's being disruptive, or when it's stopping something, which is completely and utterly the wrong way to look at these things, because it's a positive, and it creates creativity and all sorts of benefits aside from the obvious benefits. Sarah, thank you so much for joining me. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you.